Okay, in this video, I'll briefly introduce the two potential problems with our enterprise, and then I will discuss more deeply the first of the two problems. The second of the two problems will be in the next video. So the two problems we'll be considering are, why be moral, and is morality just subjective? When I ask students in class to write down potential problems with ethics, they generally get the second one. They'll write things like, isn't morality just a bunch of opinions? Everybody has their own subjective view. There's no right answer. We can't really make a case for a particular point of view because other people disagree. So that's a commonly chosen one. But the first question, why be moral, isn't really asked that much by students. And yet it's also a very important, very deep question. Why do we need to consider morality at all? Why don't we just do as we want, as we egoistically feel like we want to do? So I'm going to call these two problems the problem of egoism and the problem of relativism. So this video is going to focus on what I've called the problem of egoism. The question of why should I be moral? Why do I have to care at all about morality? Up on the screen you have an image from the Lord of the Rings movies. It's the last of the original trilogy, in which Sam Gamgee is looking at Frodo as Frodo takes the ring that he's supposed to be throwing into the pit of Mount Doom so it'll be destroyed, but instead Frodo decides suddenly at the last minute to take the ring and put it on his own finger and give in to the evil. If you've watched the movie, you realize that he does get saved from the evil in the next few minutes because first the ring is bitten off his finger by Gollum, and then while they're fighting, Gollum falls into the pit with the ring. And so it does end up having a positive ending. You can watch this video in the PowerPoint, the regular version of the PowerPoint in D2L in the course content. But the reason I include it here is because it includes a story of an invisible ring. And invisible rings there are tales about them in various mythologies. But there's in particular a tale that relates to our question, why be moral? So the existence of these sort of rings raises the question, what would you do if you had one? Would you do anything you wanted, even things that you wouldn't want others to do, things that you thought yourself were not correct, but that you might want to do anyway? Would you do exactly what was in accordance with your own moral beliefs? In other words, break rules that you don't agree with, but obey the ones that you do agree with. So if you agree with our laws against stealing and murder, would you obey those laws and yet break ones that maybe you didn't agree with, like if there were some traffic laws you didn't think were that serious? Or on the other hand, would you follow all the moral rules of our society, the moral rules you were taught, regardless of whether you believe in them as an individual person? I don't know if you've ever played that game, Would You Rather, on your phone. One of them that came up one time when my daughter was playing it was, would you rather be invisible or fly? So a lot of people have an attraction to this idea of being invisible. In this case, though, and I know this is kind of silly, but the question really is, would you rather be invisible or be ethical? And we'll do another version of the game, which is a little bit more pointed in a few minutes. Before we get to that, I want to get to this story of the invisibility ring, which I've been leading up to. And in order to talk about that, I'm just going to briefly introduce you to the lives of Socrates and Plato. Those are the years of their life up on the screen in front of you. If you haven't studied them before, Socrates was Plato's teacher. But Socrates didn't write things down. He, in fact, had a principled objection to the idea of writing as a form of communicating his ideas. So all that we know of him comes to us through the philosopher Plato, his student, who did write things down. And he wrote various dialogues, as they're called, in which Socrates was one of the speakers. And the work we're going to be talking about here is one of those works. It's called The Republic. It was written by Plato, so it's Plato's Republic. And Socrates was one of the speakers in the Republic. So in the Republic, Glaucon, who is also a speaker, tells the story of Gyges, who was a real king, And there's some potential truth to the story because he did become a king following the murder of the previous king. But although as far as we know, there was no invisibility ring involved. So according to the story, Gyges was a shepherd, and following this earthquake, there's this chasm in the ground, and he goes inside and he finds this huge bronze horse containing a dead body, and there's a ring on the dead body, which he takes and wears. And a little later, he twists it and he realizes that it makes him invisible. Well, he decides that he's going to find his way to get into the castle grounds, and when he gets there, he seduces the queen, and together they kill the king, and he becomes the king. And something that, according to the tale, was made possible by his finding the ring of invisibility. Now Glaucon says, imagine that there are two rings like that. And the just has one of those rings and the unjust the other. We're talking here about two people, an unjust person and a just person. So Glaucon's point is that nobody would be able to stand fast in their justice if they had that ring. No person would keep their hands off things that weren't theirs if he knew he could just steal. Nobody wouldn't go into houses and do whatever they want with the people they find there if they could, or kill people that they wanted to kill, or not go release people from prison that they want to release. If anybody, if they had that ring, would act in that way. So ultimately, there are no just or unjust people. There are no differences between those we think of as being just and those we think of as being unjust, except the reputation that they have. As you can see, Glaucon is pretty pessimistic about human nature. So let's play another game of Would You Rather. Would you rather be a good person with the reputation of being evil, or an evil person with the reputation of being perfectly good? And here is Glaucon filling out some of the details on our Would You Rather game. So the unjust person here is supposed to be the highest level of unjust. And the highest level of being unjust would be to be the kind of person who is able to trick everybody, pull the wool over their eyes, and be thought to be great when they really weren't. So he has to have the perfect reputation, and if he ever makes a mistake, he's able to recover himself and to manipulate his way out of it, or of course he ultimately always has access to money and friends who can help him out. On the other hand, let's look at the just man, who's perfectly noble and who wants to be and not seem good. And there is no seeming, because this guy's going to have a bad reputation. Indeed, it's important he have a bad reputation, because if he had a good reputation, then maybe that's why he would be doing it and he wouldn't be just. So we need him to have a bad reputation so we can see that he is doing it for the right reasons. And for that purpose, he has to be thought the worst. And then he'll be put to the proof and we'll see what he's really, really worth. He has to continue in that way to the hour of death, being thought unjust while he is just. So take it for a few seconds to decide. Would you rather be the good person who everyone thinks is evil, or the evil person who everyone thinks is good? If you get a chance, look at the discussion boards and see where people disagree with you. Glaucon finishes with this statement here. When both have reached the uttermost extreme, the one of justice and the other of injustice, let judgment be given which of them is happier of the two. Of course, we could tell who Glaucon thinks is going to be the happier of the two. So would you agree? Is the unjust man happier? Can you be a perfectly unjust person and be happy? Let's go back to our original question, because Glaucon seemed to be suggesting that the only reason not to be moral is to avoid being thought of as immoral, to avoid having a bad reputation, to avoid suffering the consequences of other people thinking so poorly of you that they would treat you poorly in turn, perhaps to avoid going to prison or suffering some sort of consequence. So we only are moral to avoid getting into certain kinds of trouble. That's what he is saying. Is that the only reason? An additional possible answer to the question, why be moral, is that you could say that it's in our common interest as human beings and that society as a whole is better off if we act morally. You could say it's in your interest to treat others well because you want them to treat you well, for instance. If I believe that, that seems to suggest that if I did have the invisibility ring, then I could treat others poorly. I mean, after all, they wouldn't know it, so it really wouldn't affect the good world scenario I'm trying to look for. So, I would be better off if everybody else in the world were living according to certain ethical rules, according to an ethical code, but at the same time, I wasn't. It would be kind of a perfect situation for someone who's totally egoistic. To have the world set up so that everybody else feels that for the sake of the group, they have to behave. Meanwhile, I don't feel like I'm obligated to behave the rules because I can get away with it. So there are really two different questions that we're addressing. Why does humanity need morality and why do I need to be moral? And these aren't necessarily connected. I could believe that humanity needs morality and that without it we would be living in a chaotic environment, a state of war where everybody's trying to get ahead of everybody else. Everyone's, killing to get ahead, stealing whatever they want. I could believe that and still at the same time, while I want everyone else to be moral, decide that I'm better off if I don't act according to those rules, if I can get away with it. In other words, even though it wouldn't be fair, why should I be fair? Even if I might be a hypocrite, why shouldn't I be a hypocrite? There is a story that involves two people on a boat that's been cast off of a cruise ship that went down. And one of those people is an egoist, and the other is not, is somebody who believes in common morality of our time. And the egoist doesn't have the food. The food is all food that was saved by the other person. So the egoist is in a position of wanting the other person to share his food. Well, of course, according to the egoist worldview, he should only care about himself. But he needs the other person to be willing to share. And that's kind of how I see the situation of somebody who believes in egoistic ideas, but wants the world to have an ethical code around him. Egoistically, he's better off if they do, but he does not believe in it. So he's actually being a hypocrite. But of course he doesn't care. Why should he care about his hypocrisy? He doesn't believe that he has to follow a moral code. So the common interests of humanity don't really seem to directly resolve the problem of why I personally should be moral, because even if I think that humanity needs morality, it doesn't have to follow that I myself think that I need to be moral. So the question is not about society as a whole. It's a question about me. Why should I personally be moral? Why should I be fair? Why shouldn't I be hypocritical? Socrates had an answer to this question. He thought that justice was innately desirable, important just in itself, and not for anything that comes out of it. So it's not something that's important because of what it gets for you, giving you a good reputation or helping you get ahead. It's not even important for what it does for society and allowing society to flourish. It's something that's just valuable for itself. So the person who is good, who even though they're believed to be evil, is better off because they're pursuing the thing that is innately valuable. And the fact they have a bad reputation isn't as important because one's reputation isn't as important as this innately valuable thing. So to try to understand this a little bit, it might be helpful to think of a real world example. So we can talk about a serial killer like Ted Bundy. Let's imagine some innocent person went to prison for his crimes and Ted Bundy went on to kill more people and he was never caught. According to Socrates, the innocent person who's in prison is better off than the evil person who's free. So the innocent person who was caught and punished for Ted Bundy's crime is better off than Ted Bundy. Now, think about why Socrates might think that. Do you have an answer? So Socrates' answer is that nobody would choose to be physically sick. And being unjust is a kind of sickness. In this case, a sickness of the soul. Nobody would choose to be unjust because no one would choose to be sick. And it follows from that when people are unjust, it can't be because they choose it. It must, in some sense, be because they're ignorant of what the good is. So, in other words, what Socrates is saying is that justice is a kind of innate good, like health, that we all should just obviously value. And if we don't see the value in it, there must be some kind of unawareness, some lack of awareness of what's valuable inside us. So you can look at the parts of his argument and decide what you find compelling. There may be things that you find not compelling at all here. And all of these have been criticized at one time or another. One that's often criticized is the idea that that doing evil things is only caused by ignorance of what is good. A lot of people have argued that it can be somebody might know what the good is and still do the wrong thing because of a kind of weakness of the will. People dispute the idea that nobody would choose to be unjust. But as we're doing that, I want you to go back and think a little bit about the Ted Bundy case. What if you were able to choose the kind of person you would be? And also the kinds of desires you would have. Would you want to have desires to do evil? Would people want to be a person like Ted Bundy? Or is it obvious when you consider this kind of extreme case that it would not be desirable to be the evil person? It would be more desirable to be the good person. If you could choose who you would be born as, would you choose to be the just person, as Glaucon described it, or the unjust one? If it's put in as stark terms as he puts it in, if we were to compare, for instance, somebody like Ted Bundy with a great moral figure like Martin Luther King. Sometimes people say because Socrates' answer focuses so much on the individual soul, in fact, Socrates is known for saying that the most important task in life is caring for the soul. Since it focuses so much on that, sometimes people argue that it is ultimately a somewhat self-focused or even selfish theory. So in that regard, it's helpful to tell the story of Lincoln and the pigs if you've never heard it before. In the story, Lincoln is on his way to some event wearing a suit, as you can see in the picture here. And he's with a friend, and he's having an argument with a friend, a friendly argument, about whether or not everybody is selfish. This is a theory I've often heard from students before, that ultimately, no matter what somebody does, even if it seems selfless, it must really have a selfish motive behind it. So that was the argument they were having, and Lincoln was arguing this side that, yes, everybody is ultimately selfish. And then they came along some pigs in the middle of the road. Their carriage had to stop, and they were stuck in the mud, the baby piglets, and the mother was trying to save the baby piglets. And Lincoln got out of the carriage, and he went over to the pigs, and wearing his suit, he stepped into the mud and started pulling the pigs out, getting his suit completely muddy in the process. Naturally, his friend was somewhat surprised. So the friend said, "Now, Abe, where does selfishness come in on this little episode?" And Lincoln replied, "Well, that was the very essence of selfishness. I should have had no peace of mind had I gone on and left that suffering old pig worrying over those babies. I did it to get peace of mind, don't you see?" But the question is that really selfishness? And if so, what kind of selfishness is it? For instance, is it selfish to try to develop oneself to be kinder towards others and more concerned about others? Is it selfish to want to be a better person? Does it depend on why you want to be a better person? If you want to be a better person for the sake of others, does that make it not selfish? Or is it more selfish if you want to be a better person for your own sake? Most philosophers, though, conclude that it doesn't make a lot of sense to think of somebody as being selfish if what they're really doing is acting in a completely selfless manner. Not that you have to be completely unconcerned with yourself when you do selfless things, And if you feel pleasure at doing selfless things, that seems to be the very definition of somebody who's not selfish. The side effect that one feels good about what one's doing when one is being good is not enough to make it into a selfish act. So Socrates' focus on the development of the soul, the development of the self, is not generally seen as innately selfish. It is true, though, that being less selfish can often have benefits for the individual. And in Buddhism, this idea is the idea of smart selfishness, the idea that somehow to be selfish means to follow all the recommendations of ethicists over the years, for instance, to be honest, truthful, and kind, because those things will bring benefit to oneself. So they're ultimately also good for you. I'm going to talk about one last possible answer to the question of why we should be moral. According to this answer, we should do it because it's the right thing to do. Now, this sounds like a circular argument, but the idea is that we don't need additional defense. If we know the reasons why we should act in a certain way in a particular case, that's enough. We don't have to additionally say on top of that that we should do those things. The reasons are enough. No further defense needs to be given. In other words, I need to give reasons why you should tell the truth, but I don't additionally need to come up with the reasons why you should be moral overall. The reasons why you should tell the truth should be enough to make that case. So that leads us away from this particular topic to the question that we'll be dealing with in a couple videos from now. Can we come up with good reasons why we should act in certain ways? Can I give good reasons for why someone should tell the truth, or someone should keep their promises, or someone should help others if they're in need? Can we come up with justifications? What would those justifications look like? What sort of defense for a position on ethics would we give? But before that, we're going to move on to the problem of relativism, because relativists don't think we can give any justifications like that. They think it's not possible to do so. So we'll consider them first.